1, 2, 3.
While our weekly shows are edited to time for broadcast on public TV and community radio, we offer to our members and podcast subscribers the full uncut conversation. The following is from our episode, Trump, Netanyahu, and the Weaponizing of Fear, 1 year after October 7th. These audio exclusives are made possible thanks to our member supporters.
It's been a year since October 7th, when Hamas fighters and others invaded southern Israel, killing over 1,100 people, over 800 of them civilians, and taking 251 more hostage. Since then, the Israeli government, led by Benjamin Netanyahu, has unleashed an assault on Gaza that has killed, at a conservative count, 41,000 Palestinians, most of them women and children, and set off a land grab in the occupied West Bank that is killing hundreds more. As we speak, casualties are mounting in Lebanon and northern Israel in an escalating war with Hezbollah to Israel's north. Today, we'll talk with 3 guests about how the past year has seen real human feelings of fear and sorrow and grief weaponized to devastating effect. We will end in Israel with peace activist Yoav Peck on where all this bloodshed has brought us. But we'll begin in the U.S., where at events commemorating the October 7th attacks, Donald Trump has been claiming without evidence that the Jewish state will soon cease to exist if he is not re-elected president. It's total annihilation, that's what you're talking about, Trump told the Israeli-American Council in September. You have a big protector in me, you don't have a protector on the other side, he said. At the very same time, Trump and his campaign are deeply allied with Christian evangelicals, including extreme Christian Zionists, whose investment in Israel is tied up with a belief in biblical end times when Jews convert or perish. So what is going on? For more, we go to Ben Lorber, a senior analyst at Political Research Associates and co-author of the book Safety Through Solidarity, a radical guide to fighting anti-Semitism. Ben, thanks for joining us. To start, track Donald Trump's relationship with the question of Israel and specifically Benjamin Netanyahu. Go back to 2016 and he cast himself as a kind of neutral guy in the Middle East crisis. This year, he welcomed Netanyahu to his Mar-a-Lago estate after that controversial address by the Israeli president to the joint session of Congress. What's happened since?
Yeah, thanks for having me, Laura. Yes, Donald Trump, occasionally makes overtures to the so-called isolationist wing of America first and claims to want to dial down U.S. involvement in overseas conflicts. But really, he's in bed really to an unparalleled degree with the Israeli right and with Christian Zionists in the U.S. who support the Israeli right's maximalist agenda. And during Donald Trump's presidency, he moved the U.S. Embassy to Jerusalem in violation of international law, a major provocation. He made moves to defund the Palestinian Refugee Agency, UNRWA, which obviously the Biden administration has continued. He canceled the Iran nuclear deal. He basically fulfilled the entire agenda of the Israeli right. And this isn't only, as you said, because he loves Bibi Netanyahu as a strongman, dictator. His core base here in the U.S. Is white Christian evangelicals who, because of their deep Christian Zionism, support everything the Israeli right does or believes.
Now, let's remember, Netanyahu was a guest at Mar-a-Lago immediately following his address to Congress this July. But that was a break after, months of silence right after October 7th from Trump. Am I right?
Yes, Trump is playing his cards carefully here. There is an isolationist wing of the America First movement. There are some, obviously, who think that the U.S. shouldn't fund the war in Ukraine. There are even a few who think that the U.S. maybe shouldn't, be sending taxpayer dollars to Israel right now. Those are minority voices at the top of the party. but large portions of the MAGA base, maybe not a majority, but a sizable amount, does think the U.S. Shouldn't get too involved overseas in any conflict. So I think Trump is being careful. But at the end of the day, Trump is going to fulfill the dictates of the Israeli right. He's going to give Bibi Netanyahu and everyone else in the Israeli government full reign, right, to escalate their horrific campaign in Gaza, to pursue war in Lebanon, which is already happening, right? I mean, I think, the Trump administration and everyone, backing him would give full reign to the Israeli right's, maximalist ambitions.
So he has gone from sort of vagueness to clear alliance with the Israeli right, embrace of Netanyahu, at the same time as he has deepened his alliance with folks that you've called Christian Zionists, some of them, extremists whose worldview is, as I mentioned, bound up with this idea of end times. Give us some names. Who are some of these folks? Who's Paula White, for example, the woman who was there leading him in prayer before the last debate, and there right before January 6th, at that rally that led to the insurrection?
Yeah, so folks like Paula White and Lou Engle and Cheyenne are members of a Christian nationalist movement called the New Apostolic Reformation. They're really at the cutting edge of Christian nationalism and Christian Zionism. They basically want to Christianize every aspect of US government and society. They call it taking dominion over the seven mountains, which basically is all of American politics, education, media, family, business, and culture. They want to impose a fundamentalist and theocratic agenda upon all Americans and ultimately upon the world. And supporting the Israeli right, is part of this. As you say, they have an end times agenda that basically sees a future in which Israel will be engaged in cataclysmic war with its neighbors, and that will ultimately bring the return of Jesus, right? At which point, all Jews, all Muslims, all non-believing Christians, in their view, are forced to convert or perish. So this is not an agenda that will make Jews safe, to put it mildly. Nor is it good for Palestinians or for Muslims or for anyone in the world.
Now, a lot of people have wacky beliefs out there. Do they go beyond spouting these strange views and opinions?
Well, yeah, the whole purpose of the New Apostolic Reformation and other Christian nationalist movements is to put it into practice. They aren't content with merely believing these things. They want to, sculpt the world to meet their vision. So that's why they are intent at capturing all levers of power in the United States, right, to impose their Christian nationalist vision. Since October 7th, they have worked overtime to lobby the US government for increased aid to Israel, to lobby for war with Iran. And this isn't only pastors and influential advisors. It's also GOP House Speaker Mike Johnson. He's a Christian Zionist. It's even, JD Vance. He's not part of the New Apostolic Reformation, but he has his own Christianity informed views of support for Israel. We're talking GOP leaders across the board are informed by this Christian Zionism in one way or another.
Is there money in the picture?
Yeah, there is money. I mean, it's hard to track because a lot of Christian nationalist organizations are registered as churches, so their finances are opaque, right? But there is money. There's also people power. I mean, it's estimated that at least 60 million evangelicals in the country hold to some version of a view that Israel is part of prophecy in their eyes. And the largest Christian Zionist organization, named Christians United for Israel, claims 10 million members. That's larger than the entire American Jewish population. So they do have money. They also have people, and they have a bedrock of very fervent support around the country.
When we look at what's happening in Israel right now, we see, of course, Benjamin Netanyahu's extreme cabinet that include people who have themselves been deeply part of the settler movement in the occupied West Bank. How do the folks that you're talking about now relate to that settler movement? And have you been able to track any money flows from one side of the Atlantic to the other in that regard?
Yes, a 2018 investigation by Haaretz, I believe, found that at that time, over the last decade, over $65 million has flown to the West Bank from Christian Zionists in America, and that was in 2018. So I'm sure the number has only grown, right? Christian Zionists are intent on helping the Israeli right colonize the West Bank because they view it, much like the Israeli right does, as the biblical heartland, as Judea and Samaria. You even have many Christian Zionists who will go to the West Bank and volunteer to work for free on Israeli settlements and agricultural communities. Since October 7th, that kind of volunteer tourism has only increased. In fact, I believe back in November, there were headlines about this group called Hayovel, who had American cowboys from the Midwest, you replete with cowboy hats, who went to volunteer in the West Bank. And they were very clear: we are standing on the front lines of Western civilization in the fight against radical Islam, and that's why we're here. So they're very connected to the settler movement.
So to step back to our elections again for a second, what are you making of this picture? And what do you think our audiences need to understand about the way that Trump is manipulating fears of anti-Semitism as he casts himself as the defender of Israel, a state that many people in this country care a lot about, fear a lot about, want to see peace in, and therefore are deeply susceptible to these arguments?
Yeah, I mean, we're in a moment since October 7th of real anti-Semitism being on the rise. And I think it's important to name that and to be clear that we oppose when a synagogue is targeted, simply for being a synagogue, or when a Jewish individual who might be walking down the street is harassed simply for being, Jewish. Those behaviors are absolutely unacceptable. At the same time, you have a rise of actors across the political spectrum, not only on the right, but also many on the center, and even some liberals who are falsely accusing the movement for justice in Israel, Palestine, of being anti-Semitic. It is clearly not anti-Semitic to call for a ceasefire or to call for an arms embargo or to name what's going on in Gaza as a genocide, right? But you have actors, not only Donald Trump, but also, President Biden and, folks like ADL CEO Jonathan Greenblatt and Christian Zionists who are all teaming up, despite their differences, to attempt to pass laws that are going to restrict speech that are critical of Israel.
And to be very clear, Donald Trump has been explicit that if he were to be elected, I think he said that those who were found protesting for ceasefire, against apartheid in Israel, in support of Palestinians post October 7th, I think he said they would be deported, removed from the country.
Yeah. Yeah, that's horrific. And that, of course, is in line with the GOP agenda of mass deportations, right? So we are looking at a very significant, crackdown. They're also threatening to investigate groups who are supportive of Palestinian rights with terrorism allegations. That could be very serious. And of course, they're unfounded, right? So we're looking at the right is exploiting this crisis to use the state to suppress dissent, to suppress progressive movements. And that's something that all progressives, even if you disagree with some of what the protesters are saying, that's something we should all be concerned about as a violation of our free speech rights.
Is any of this making any of us any safer? And given
No.
that it isn't, why do you think these appeals to our security work so well?
Yeah, I mean, it's not making Jews any safer. I think there's a lot, that we.
What about anybody?
Yeah, it's really not making anybody safer in this country. I think for a long time, Israel's defenders have used this false notion that criticism of Israel or Zionism tends to be inherently anti-Semitic in order to stifle free speech and in order in our era to bolster authoritarianism. That doesn't make Muslim Americans any safer. It doesn't make Jewish Americans any safer. It doesn't make Black Americans. All these groups are well represented, often at the forefront of this movement for a ceasefire. It's one of the most inspiring movements of our generation. And it doesn't, bode well in a moment when all of our freedoms are under threat in this country. It doesn't make us any safer to empower the state to go after protesters in this way. And, as a Jew, it's especially galling to me that it's done in the name of Jewish safety, supposedly, because, taking away people's speech rights, deporting people in the name of keeping me safe doesn't keep me safe. What keeps me safe is social movements and being with my allies and being in community with other marginalized groups to fight for a better future in this country.
To come back to the United States for a second and this new apostolic reformation and the religious evangelical right that is backing Donald Trump, they aren't a large part of our population. Can you tell us why, in your view, they have such weight in our politics? And remind us perhaps what some of the statistics actually are demographically.
Yeah, well, I can tell you that the share of, church-going Christians in our country is falling, and that demographically, white America is increasingly becoming a minority. Demographically, Christian America is becoming a minority, and the Christian right knows this, and they're terrified, and that's why they are working hard to enshrine, minority rule for their agenda. Polling has shown that upwards of 60 or 70 million evangelicals, not only white evangelicals, do believe in some version of end times prophecy. That's still a minority in a country of over 300 million. And for over 40 years, the right has been building up institutions, building up political power, building up a long-term strategy to work to change our Supreme Court, to work to change our federal government and our laws and our policies, to gut abortion rights, to end the separation of church and state, to basically attack our liberal democracy. And today they're on the cusp of succeeding more than ever before. So it's really important for us to know this as a long-term threat and to see the U.S. support for Israel as part of this. Often, we don't make these connections between U.S. support for the Israeli right and the domestic agenda of Christian nationalism. I think we need to see it all as part of a Christian nationalist and Christian Zionist agenda.
And to elaborate just a little on what these end times prophecies are, how would you summarize?
It's important to know there is a diversity of views in the Christian Zionist movement, but those who believe in the end times basically believe that the establishment of the state of Israel is part of God's prophetic clock. It's a sign to them that prophecies in the book of Revelations and other books of the Bible are coming true. So their view is to get as many Jews as possible to move to Israel and to support the expansionist agenda of the Israeli right. And they believe that Israel is destined by God to go to war with Iran, and that's going to pull the U.S. and the world into a cataclysmic war. And at some point during this war, Jesus will return, and there'll be some sort of judgment where Christians are going to be saved, and everyone else has to convert or perish. Now, there are Christian Zionists who don't believe this. They believe something called the prosperity gospel, meaning if I bless Israel, God will bless me. God will bless my family, my nation, my community. So it's important. Not every Christian Zionist who you meet does believe in this end times theology, but no matter what they believe, they're seeing the politics of the Middle East through this biblical lens, through a messianic lens, and they're instrumentalizing Jews, not to mention Palestinians, in service of a biblical agenda that's divorced from reality.
Ben, finally, are you afraid at this moment? Does this moment, where we find ourselves right now, scare you?
Yes, I'm afraid for the future of our liberal multiracial democracy here in the U.S. I'm afraid for the safety of Palestinians and Israeli Jews and Lebanese and people and everyone in the Middle East. I'm afraid with the rise of the authoritarian right in America, in Israel, across Europe and around the world. I'm also inspired by our democratic movements that are determined not to let them win and that are determined to preserve and expand the promise of our democracy.
Ben Lorber, Senior Analyst at Political Research Associates in Somerville, Massachusetts. You can obviously find them on the web. Ben, thank you for your work.
Thanks for having me.
Laura Flanders and Friends asks the questions we need to be asking to move forward. While the commercial media is centered on what sells advertising, which is too often fear, we're centered on change makers, imagining a better world and creating the solutions to get us there. That's thanks to the generous support of viewers and listeners like you. While we are independent media, we do depend on you. Please contribute by making a one-time donation or make it monthly. Go to lauraflanders.org/donate. As Angela Davis says, when vast numbers of people come together, this is how change happens. Please come together with us now. Thanks for listening, and thanks for your continued support. Now back to our conversation.
So why does weaponizing fear in this way work so well? And what can we do about that? Joining me to reflect on that difficult question is my friend Phyllis Bennis, new internationalist fellow at the Institute for Policy Studies in Washington, D.C., and the author of several books on the United Nations and the Middle East. Phyllis, you and I have been around this story our entire lives, and yet it seems as if the weaponizing of fear works as well as it ever has. And the ability to stop it seems to be as much as a loss now as it was, for example, a year ago. So I'm coming to you, I guess, with the question, why does it work so well? What's some of the history? And where do you see, I don't know, some ways forward?
Well, I think if we start at the end of what you just asked, Laura, which is a bunch of all the right questions for sure, if we start with what do we do about it, we should take one step back and say we actually have made incredible progress in this country in the last 20 years, the last 10 years, and most of all, ironically enough, as this horrific genocide has taken hold across Gaza, we have managed to transform the political discourse in this country. So you now have a majority of people in this country, 70% of Democrats, saying we don't want to send any more weapons to Israel. I can't imagine that from 5 years ago or 2 years ago or last year. This is new. People are seeing this genocide playing out in real time. Now, that doesn't mean that it's close to ending. Unfortunately, the change in discourse in our very, very broken, flawed democracy doesn't mean that the policy changes. But you do need to change the discourse if you're going to change the policy. So it has been a step. It has been a step. And we should be very clear that all the work of the student encampments, the work of the uncommitted, all of that work has had an impact. We need to move it forward. We need to move it further. So when we look at it now, why does fear work so well? Part of it in this country, when you talk about, for example, weaponizing the charge, the false charge of anti-Semitism against people who are criticizing Israel, not criticizing Jews, not saying anything against Jews as people, Jews as Jews has nothing to do with it, but it has everything to do with the government of Israel and how they are carrying out a genocide. But it works partly because real anti-Semitism is on the rise in this country. Real anti-Semitism that is rooted not in criticism of Israel, not in Palestinian rights, not in calling for a ceasefire, but is rooted in white supremacy. You know, Laura, you and I have talked about this before, that the origins of 20th century anti-Semitism, not the old anti-Semitism of centuries ago, but the modern anti-Semitism in this country started in the 20s, in the 1920s, with the rise of the Klan. The Klan went after Jews parallel to how it went after African Americans. It killed far more African Americans, lynched far more African Americans than it did Jews. but it did lynch Jews as well. Jews were also the enemy of white supremacists, including the Klan, and up to 2017 in Charlottesville, when the neo-Klan, if you will, the neo-Nazis, were marching with their tiki torches, and they were chanting, "Jews will not replace us." Right. This so-called Great Replacement theory that they were relying on. So real anti-Semitism is on the rise, but the problem is, with all the attention being put on the false claim that criticizing Israel, that demanding a ceasefire, demanding an end to genocide, standing with South Africa, asking the International Court of Justice to hold Israel accountable for genocide, those things are not anti-Semitic. But if you put all your focus there, you're not out there ending the kind of real anti-Semitism that comes from the right.
And of course, we have seen this weaponizing of fear before, not just in the Middle East context, but in our own. I'm thinking back, of course, to 9/11.
Absolutely right. You know, when 9/11 happened, it was a horrific crime. The Israelis at the time, in the person of one Benjamin Netanyahu, who was then, as now, the prime minister of Israel, was asked what did he think after the attacks of 9/11. And without a second thought, he said, "It's very good." And then, maybe realizing what that sounded like, he said, "Well, not very good, but it will generate immediate sympathy." That was his understanding of it. Not sympathy for almost 3,000 people who had been killed, not wondering what had driven people to such a desperate act of violence. None of that. All he saw was, this is going to be great for us in Israel, because now the US will be even more on our side.
Well, more sensitive, perhaps. It was his point that the Americans would be more sensitive to what it feels like to be under attack. Was that his point?
I think that was exactly his point. And unfortunately, President Bush at the time played right into that. His position was, we've got a choice. We can either go to war or let him get away with it. So not surprisingly, people didn't want to let him get away with it. So they supported the war in enormous numbers. You and I remember, Laura, from that period, when the US went to war against Afghanistan, ironically enough, on October 7th, then of 2001, just 3 weeks after 9/11, when the US went to war, 88% of the population of this country thought it was a great thing to do, despite the fact that none of the hijackers were Afghans. None of them lived in Afghanistan. None of them went to school in Afghanistan. None of them trained in Afghanistan. None of them went to flight school in Afghanistan.
And the people of Afghanistan were about as responsible as so many of the people of Gaza.
Exactly.
The point that you just made is so important, that we tend to be given binary options of something or nothing. Would love, I mean, aren't there always other options?
There are always other options. And at that time, there were clear options, as there were in Israel after October 7th of 2023. There was a crime committed. Not everything that happened was a crime, but there was a crime in the killing of Israeli civilians and civilians from other countries who were there at the time, and taking hostages. Those are crimes under international law. They could have been dealt with as enormous crimes. Israel could have asked for help to go after them, to find people and arrest them and bring them to justice. Just as after 9/11, the US could have said, President Bush could have made a speech. In one of my books, I wrote the speech he should have given after he finished reading My Pet Goat to the children in the elementary school classroom in Florida, and said to people, we have been the victims of a terrible crime. And we realize now that nothing less than absolute cooperation with the whole world will be sufficient to bring people to justice. Instead, he said, all we can do is go to war and use B-52 bombers as if they were flying bounty hunters. Nobody was brought to justice. The people who had carried out this crime were long dead. And thousands of Afghans then died. And then hundreds of thousands of Iraqis died, none of whom had anything to do with that crime, just as the people of Gaza, 2.3 million, of whom almost 42,000 people have been killed, 70% of them children and women, another 100,000 or more seriously injured, the highest number of pediatric amputations that have ever been seen anywhere in the world, not to mention tens of thousands, maybe scores of thousands of people who lie dead under the rubble of virtually the entire infrastructure of Gaza that has been bombed to smithereens. And people died painful deaths that may have taken days before they died because there was no way to dig them out. Those people had nothing to do with what happened on October 7th. And what happened on October 7th included great crimes for which there should be accountability. But Israel, as the occupying power, did not and does not have the right to go to war against the people of Gaza because someone from Gaza had committed a crime inside Israel. Because that was not an attack by a member state, by another state. The right of self-defense that Israel and the US keep claiming doesn't apply all the time, anytime you want to say it. Yeah. It only applies in certain circumstances, and when there's something that happens from a territory that you are occupying militarily, it doesn't apply. Israel did not have that internationally sanctioned right that is found in Article 51 of the UN Charter.
People talk about a tinderbox in the Middle East, and it feels as if that is what we are seeing igniting as we speak, with more death and killing happening in other parts of Israel and, of course, southern Lebanon, Lebanon itself, as well as Syria and Iran and Yemen, you name it. Tinderboxes, I think, perhaps don't quite capture. It's not quite the right metaphor in the sense that the injustices of the past have set this situation up this way. Do you see a way forward? Do you see a future that could be a model for us to even just think about how do we get from here to someplace else rather than just an ever-increasing conflagration?
Absolutely, absolutely. And that has to do with international law. We hear over and over again these days in our country, from our government, from our president, from everybody in power, from the media, we hear about the rules-based international order. That doesn't exist. That's a figment of propaganda, that somebody likes the tone of it because it sounds very official, but it means you don't have to talk about real international law. Real international law exists. Treaties that have been signed, covenants that have been voted on. It exists in the books. You can argue over interpretation. You can say, well, it doesn't mean this, it means this instead. But we're very clear what international law is. The rules-based international order doesn't exist anywhere. It's the rules the United States set for the rest of the world to abide by.
But have we any ways of actually implementing international law?
We do. And that has to do with what this amazing act was of South Africa when they took the initiative to bring Israel to court, to the International Court of Justice, the highest court in the world, the official court of the United Nations, an institution like the UN itself, ironically enough, that had always been seen to belong to the white colonial powers, the settler colonies, and the Europeans, the wealthy, powerful countries. This was for them to use against Africans, against Asians, against Arabs, not the other way around. And South Africa said, you know what? We suffered through decades and generations of apartheid, and we fought through it and we won. We won a kind of democracy, flawed, problematic, still lots of challenges, but we overthrew this horrific system without having to destroy our country. And now it's our obligation, our moral obligation. That was the words of the South African foreign minister who was in Washington, D.C. just last week. He said it was our moral obligation to hold Israel accountable for this new set of violations of, among other things, the crime of apartheid that led now to Israeli violations of the covenant against genocide. So you have, for the first time, the countries of the global South, the country with perhaps the greatest, highest level of moral credibility in the world, that being post-apartheid South Africa, bringing to the court the closest ally of the most powerful nuclear country in the world, the United States, bringing Israel up on charges. And of course, as we know, the court doesn't have, it not only doesn't have an army, it doesn't even have a police force. It doesn't even have an investigative team. But it has the importance and the credibility of being the UN's court, the highest court in the world. And one of the things that means is that the court's initial ruling, the temporary ruling that said that as far as they could tell so far, Israel's action in the war in Gaza do constitute plausibly the crime of genocide. And as a result, they demanded that Israel stop killing people in Gaza, stop attacking the cities such as Rafah, and making the situation worse. And they said that every other country that has signed the Genocide Convention, like the United States, has an obligation also to do everything in its power to stop that genocide.
And could that architecture of international law also be used against the perpetrators within Hamas and Hezbollah?
In the context of the International Criminal Court, yes, and that's exactly what is being considered there now. The prosecutor at the court has asked for a judgment the prosecutor at the International Criminal Court has asked the judges to issue arrest warrants both for the leadership of Israel, Prime Minister Netanyahu, and the Defense Minister Gallant, and also against 3 top officials of Hamas, 2 of whom the Israelis, of course, have already killed. But recognizing that that is about individual criminal responsibility. In the context of the International Court of Justice, the broader obligation goes against countries like our own. And that's why last week, the General Assembly of the UN voted overwhelmingly, 124 countries in favor, only 14 countries against, including the US and Israel, and including 7 tiny small island states that are all treaty bound to do what the US wants it to do in the UN, to say no. So overwhelmingly voted to implement this decision by the International Court of Justice, not the one on genocide, but the one that says that the entire Israeli occupation and apartheid system is illegal. So it's now a whole new world of decisions by the courts being implemented potentially by the United Nations. How that plays out, we still don't know. This is still too new. This all just happened this last week. But the reality is that we now know how it could look. You asked what it could be like in the future.
Yeah.
This is what it could be like. Real law, not some notion of the international rules-based order that we're going to make up as we go along, but existing international law. Wouldn't that be something?
Phyllis Bennis of the Institute for Policy Studies in Washington, D.C. Thank you so much for your time and for your work.
Thank you, Laura. It's a pleasure to be with you.
Laura Flanders and Friends asks the questions we need to be asking to move forward. While the commercial media is centered on what sells advertising, which is too often fear, we're centered on change makers, imagining a better world and creating the solutions to get us there. That's thanks to the generous support of viewers and listeners like you. While we are independent media, we do depend on you. Please contribute by making a one-time donation or make it monthly. Go to lauraflanders.org/donate. As Angela Davis says, when vast numbers of people come together, this is how change happens. Please come together with us now. Thanks for listening, and thanks for your continued support. Now back to our conversation.
We end today's program with Yoav Peck. The present brinkmanship is not inevitable. Those in power are choosing a direction, and they hold our lives in their hands, he wrote recently in a blog posting titled Flying Off the Cliff. Peck is an organizational psychologist and Israeli peace activist. Raised in New York, he's lived in Israel for 50 years. We reached him a few days ago at his home in Jerusalem. Yoav, thank you so much for joining me on this sober occasion. It has been difficult all year, and it's especially so today, to begin by asking, how are you? But how are you?
Yeah, thanks, Laura. It's good to be here. It's always encouraging that people care enough to tune into something like this and to hear about what's happening to us. How I am, well, you ask any Israeli these days how they are, they immediately distinguish between the personal and the national, and decreasingly that we can make that distinction because the national is personal, and my country has been in a crisis for nearly a year, and so I'm in a crisis. If you ask how I am, I'm very, very worried about the present and the future. I deal with feelings of helplessness in the face of a government that has no interest in its citizens. And that's how I am. On the personal level, my four kids, my four grandkids are okay, and my wife is fine, and you carry on living your life. But there's this heavy cloud hanging over all of us daily, and we're addicted to the news reports, and we just are all the time walking on eggshells and wondering when the next turn for the worse is going to come about.
Well, one of those turns seems to have happened in the last days and weeks with the assault on Lebanon. But before we get to that, let's go back. I mean, reading the posts that you have published online over the last year, I've seen you over and over again think, well, this moment is a moment where we can hope there will be a breakthrough. We hope that we can take a different direction. Okay, not this moment, but maybe this one. And now you've started talking about a country that's driving over a cliff. Where do you think your hope has gone, or where has your hope been resting?
Well, I'm hopeful. I am. You can't extinguish my hope, but my hope is in the fact that two positive things have come out of this crisis. One of them is that the Palestinian issue is on the table again, after great effort was invested in disappearing the Palestinians and the Palestinian issue over the last years. Concepts like managing the conflict have finally blown apart, and the Palestinians are here as they've always been here. They're here to stay, and we must confront how we're going to build a future together with them. So that's good news. The other piece of good news is that hundreds of thousands of Israelis have come out of their living rooms and are marching in the streets and are manning and womening the intersections across the country. People have awoken to political activism, starting with the judicial coup, the attempt at a judicial coup a year ago. People began waking up, and now with the hostage situation, people are out there and active, and I have great hope that as we move forward, people will increasingly identify the disaster of the present moment to the 57 years of occupation of Palestine, and at least some of those masses will remain in the streets to demand that we reach an ongoing long-term settlement agreement with the Palestinians.
For people that haven't been following closely, I mentioned at the top that Benjamin Netanyahu has, like Donald Trump, stood trial on criminal charges. As I understand it, his defense team is saying that he can't actually testify again as long as war continues for him to manage. Is that what you understand to be the status quo?
Absolutely.
And how big of a role do you think that's playing in this situation?
Enormous. Benjamin Netanyahu will do anything to stay out of court, to stay out of jail, and to stay away from having to take responsibility for the disaster of October 7th and everything that's happened since. So it's a one-man show as far as he's concerned, and he really has no interest in the citizens, and increasingly people are awakening to the cynical use of his position to drive us further and further from the possibility of peace.
Now, the protesters who were out in the streets around his attempted judicial reform that you referred to earlier, they didn't talk about occupation, most of them, did they? I wonder whether you think that has really changed. Do you think really those who are in the streets today will stay there as the occupation continues?
It's really hard to say how this is going to play out, but you are right that many of the people during the judicial coup and also now, many of the people out there in the streets do not identify the occupation as something that is oppressing all of us. And they're much more focused on freeing the hostages in a pretty short-sighted way of viewing the situation. People are traumatized and re-traumatized and dwelling in October 7th. The media is supporting it every day. No matter when you turn on the radio, you can hear 11 months later people telling terrible stories about October 7th. But October 7th is a year ago, and where we are now is a completely different place. So no, we have a major educational challenge ahead of us to get people to see the link between Israel's occupation of the Palestinians and the present situation.
You say we're in a completely different place. Can you elaborate?
Well, I was, along with many other Israelis, in favor of a military response in the weeks following the barbaric invasion on October 7th. But 2 weeks, 3 weeks, a strong response, that's it. Then what? And we have just continued. We've upped the ante every week, and the war that's currently being conducted in Gaza has nothing to do with the original catalyst for all of this. It has to do with sending soldiers as the pawns of a chess game that a cynical chess player is playing with them. I would hate to be the parents of a soldier today, sending my child off to a war that has no future, no horizon. Netanyahu continues to succeed in keeping a secret about what his plan for the day after the shooting ends might be. And that's because I believe he has no plan. And his plan is for us to escalate and escalate, as you've seen in the last week, now spreading into Lebanon.
Now, you've been clear, and I appreciate your conversation thus far. You've been clear you're not a political analyst, you're a psychoanalyst. You look at the psychology of organizations and human feelings as well. And I want to go back to that word trauma, because it's not unique to Israelis or Israeli Jews or Palestinians. Heaven knows, we in the United States have seen our own traumas manipulated for political goals. And we too have bought the line that violence will make us safer. Why? Why is it so easy for that to work at the human level? And what might work better? How could we rejigger perhaps our psychology in our response to these attacks and these feelings of fear?
Yeah, fear. Fear is you hit the nail on the head. Fear can be manipulated and has been manipulated. As I say, the media is complicit in this, in maintaining people's level of fear. And I just, courage is what comes to mind at the moment. Until a year ago, I worked with the Bereaved Families Forum, an organization of 700 Israeli and Palestinian families who lost a dear one to the conflict. And all 700 of these people have said, we suffered a terrible loss, and what we are doing with that loss is turning it into working for peace so that no other families have to endure what we have endured. And that's the kind of courage that we're looking for. People who can take their hurt and their pain and their fear and say, I am going to put an end to this. I am not going to be adding something to the cycle of fear and violence and defensiveness and aggressiveness. I am taking a different path. And that is that's what makes us human. The animals react instinctively. Human beings are capable of experiencing pain and holding themselves back and saying, how am I going to conduct myself in this situation? And I think we're capable of doing that. We just need to find the backbone that will enable us to follow through.
So are some people just born with stiffer DNA in their backbones? Or what distinguishes those families that react that way from the others who react, as we've seen so many on so many of our countries, screaming for blood?
Well, when you're driven into sorrow and grief and bereavement, you can either turn around and strike back, or you can be with your feelings and your experience and ask yourself serious questions. It has nothing to do with genes or DNA or anything else. It has to do with people discovering their greatness and their bigness and their willingness to create a future for their children and their grandchildren. As far as I'm concerned today, my true employer is my 4 grandchildren, and I work for them and for their future. I'm looking towards a future where they choose not to use their American passports and stay here to continue building and healing and recreating the Israel that we can be.
What's your picture of that, dare I ask?
Well, a long process of healing. I came back from a visit to Northern Ireland, where 26 years ago they stopped killing each other, more or less. And for 26 years, they've been doing the healing work to break down stereotypes, to integrate neighborhoods, to bring people together. And that's the real work. When Fidel Castro, when the last shot was fired in Havana, Fidel Castro said, "Now begins the revolution." And that's what I'm waiting for. The day when we don't have to hide in our shelters, when we can come out and quietly, cautiously extend our hands to our neighbors and create a new reality here. And it's possible.
I mean, I'm trying to not make you play the role of political analyst, but you have touched in your blogs on that this ongoing war is not just cruel and, genocidal, but is also ill-advised in terms of security, even for Netanyahu himself, even for, it just doesn't make any sense. Would you like to elaborate on any of that aspect of all of this? It's not only is it dangerous and maniacal, but it is not going to take the state to a safer place.
Well, the thing that I can't understand is how easily people have forgotten that repeatedly Hezbollah has declared that when there's a ceasefire in Gaza, they will stop firing at the north. And by the way, Laura, I do have to tell you that you referred to the assault on Lebanon. I'm not quite comfortable with that because Hezbollah has been assaulting us as well. So I am an Israeli, and my son lives on a Lebanese border kibbutz. And we have been, the people of the north have been subjected to terrible bombardment ever since October 8th. So the assault has been two-sided, but the thing that people keep forgetting is that Hezbollah has repeated, even just the other day, Nasrallah said that when there is a ceasefire in Gaza, we will stop firing on the north of Israel. And that's the key. And that's the thing that Netanyahu will do anything to avoid, is sitting down at a negotiation table and finding a way to stop the shooting, to bring the hostages home, and to enable a creative, probably pan-Arabic force to come into Gaza and to create an ongoing ceasefire so that they can begin the 20 or 30-year process of rebuilding their land. So
Beautiful.
that's a central piece of it. It's amazing. Israelis, the smartest Israelis, are just talking about how Hezbollah did this and we have to do that, and they keep erasing the fact that Hezbollah has one condition for stopping the aggression towards us, and that's that we stop the aggression in Gaza.
It reminds me of what we were told in advance of 9/11. Take your forces out of Saudi Arabia. Yeah, there's always more to the story, and where you begin the clock is always critical. We'd like to hear a little bit more about the work that you're doing with Israelis and Palestinians in the past year. Has that peace work that you described continued? And how has it been affected?
Absolutely, yeah. Today I'm serving as the executive director of a program called Achvat Amim, which means Solidarity of Nations. And we bring young people from North America and Europe for a 4-month experience where they serve as volunteers in a variety of human rights organizations, and they learn a curriculum based on our stand against occupation and for self-determination for all people. So that's the work I'm doing professionally.
Has that continued in the last year?
Absolutely. Yeah, there are some brave folks who just insisted on being here. There are thousands of young Americans parading on campuses, and the level of ignorance about what's actually going on here. It's not a show of the good guys and the bad guys. It's much more complex than that. And the people who understand that are coming here to try to go deeper and to understand what's going on, which is what we enable them to do. The other project that I am particularly enamored of, we call Beyond Persuasion. What we found is that persuading people to agree with me doesn't work. And convince, the word convince comes from the Latin roots for vanquish. And people don't want to be convinced of anything. So how do you reach out to someone who hates your guts and who disagrees with you on all of the most fundamental things? Well, it's possible. And unbelievably, in the workshops that we run, people come in and they say, I can't talk to my family anymore. I can't talk to my neighbors anymore. Anytime politics comes up, everything explodes. And I know you're dealing with this in the United States as well. And so we have a model for enabling people to discover the ways to neutralize hatred and to be able to bridge the gaps that seem unfathomable, to bridge those gaps and to draw closer to their my father used to like to call them his adversaries, because they are not our enemies. And in fact, in the morning, he used to pray for his adversaries because they made him stronger. So
is there a first step that you could share with us in terms of beginning those conversations that we could perhaps put into practice?
Yeah, well, we could remind ourselves that God gave us a gentle hint when he gave us 2 ears and 1 mouth. I mean, people are always busy with saying the clever thing or speaking points or whatever it is they need to say. But the strongest way to grow closer to someone and to open his eyes and his ears is to listen to him first. And we are terrible listeners.
Well, Yoav, I hope that someday we get to meet in person and perhaps we could learn more about what you're doing. It's important work, and I thank you for it. Thank you for taking some time with us today.
I really appreciate it. As you can see, I love the opportunity to express what I'm experiencing and feeling, and you've offered that in a very gracious way. So thanks so much.
We hope you enjoyed listening to this full uncut conversation. These audio exclusives are made possible thanks to our member supporters. Please join our members now by making a one-time donation at lauraflanders.org/donate. or make it monthly. Go to patreon.com/Laura Flanders and Friends. That's also where you'll find more information on this conversation in the episode notes posted. That's patreon.com/Laura Flanders and Friends. And thanks again to all our member supporters.